So this is a fun thing to talk about. What would a lesson of war applied to future carrier design and carrier design during World War II? Now, I'm going to say this. This video is not going to be as long as it was originally intended to be, and again I apologise. Pneumonia. But hopefully I'll be able to cover the core points I was hoping to do. And I'm probably going to end up taking a lot more drink in front of you because it's going to keep me going and stop coughing. Now, one of the things that often comes up with war experience, carriers and carrier design, is a number of quite prominent historians have focused in on one nation's experience of warfighting carrier operations over others. And they often therefore attribute everything to that nation's experience. And realistically, what you actually have is a synthesis, because, believe it or not, the Americans are just as interested in British carrier experience as the British are in American carrier experience. Because if you consider it, what have the British been getting mostly getting experience of? Very, very heavy operations against land-based aviation. Let's be honest, the Mediterranean was non-stop fun days. There were lots of operations which were constant carrier battles. But there isn't a carrier on the other side. There's a large lump of earth supporting an airfield. So your usual advantage of your opponent will eventually run out of fuel and have to go home, or you can make a large hole in it and it will take on so much water it will sink, goes away. They still do counter-air base operations. That's a core part, again, of what British carriers get up to in World War II. But it's a very different operational philosophy you have to adopt from dealing with a carrier-based aviation threat to a land-based aviation threat. Or rather, a carrier-centered based aviation threat versus a land-centered land-based sort of centered aviation threat. It's the realities of this. And this leads me into an interesting discussion, because Admiral Sir Charles Edward Kennedy Purvis is a really interesting character at this point. He was the Deputy First Sea Lord from the 29th of July 1942 to March 1946. And basically, he took on a lot of the roles that traditionally had been divided between the First Sea Lord and the Third Sea Lord. You see, basically, the Third Sea Lord was kind of overwhelmed at the time with organising the construction of everything. So they didn't have the time to chair their future shipbuilding committee, which is normally what the Third Sea Lord would be in charge of, organising the future planning of ships. And the First Sea Lord doesn't have as much time on their hands as well, because they're running operations around the world. So a lot of their admin tasks and a lot of their committees that they would normally be chairing and be involved in, i.e. the Future Operations Committee, the future of this, and are not able to be done. Because they're busy. So they make a Deputy First Sea Lord, and they find a very good, very smart admiral called Sir Charles Edward Kennedy Purvis. And they basically charge him with designing the future of the Navy and the future of operations, both during the war and post-war. And he doesn't really have a direct counterpart on the US side. There are people who certainly fulfill the role, but they're mostly in the bureaus and they already have the role. They're not summoned in and not given the role from various different departments. They are already in that role. So his experience is kind of interesting, because it's how does he form his organisation? How does he work it all together? And he would describe himself as an information sucker. But probably the phraseology he would use today, and describe it today, would be an information hoover or vacuum. he basically wanted information from everywhere. This is what's happening in. And this is one of the reasons why the Americans actually start talking with him. And the Americans are very interested and would like to have someone on his committee. They never get someone on his committee. But there is a lot of connections between his committee and their American counterparts. And this is where some really interesting stuff starts to go backwards and forwards. And you have to remember, the American and British design philosophies on carriers was not as far apart as sometimes it's made out to be. The differences weren't in what they wanted from their carriers. The differences were in what they were prepared to sacrifice to get what they needed from carriers for their geostrategic position in the face of the treaties and the treaty limitations. Now, the big problem was never the 27,000 ton standard tonnage limit. The big problem was always the cumulative limit of tonnage. The moment you get rid of that, their designs start going very quickly. Because when you've got 27,000 tons as your standard displacement limit, you can get an Ark Royal-sized air group with a illustrious level of armouring, and probably deck-edge lifts as well. You can get everything the British have been dreaming about. And the British do like the idea of deck-edge lifts. They just want to design them in such a way that the North Sea won't nick aircraft. As I try and explain many, many times to people, and some people really do not understand this, the Royal Navy is traumatised by World War One. They are traumatised by fire aboard Ben Mashri. They are traumatised by losing 3 cruisers, Abaco, Cressy and Hogue, in the same day. And they are, to an extent, traumatised by the fact that in 1 year, they lost more aircraft from their ships operating with the fleet to the sea than they did to enemy action. And by that I mean nicking the aircraft off the decks of the ships in various points. So yes, there were lots of different traumas which the Royal Navy went through in World War One, and World War Two is when they're excising them. The traumas of World War Two also were what the US Navy were excising pretty much conclusively in Korean War and the Vietnam War. That's when the US Navy really goes, yeah, we're here. Navies have this, but no. So, one of the really interesting things there, and one of the things I used as the basis for a lot of my research on this, was I was lucky enough in National Archives to go through a lot of the Future Building Committee's notes, and to track down in various archives some of their personal records and notes, and to talk with some of the people who have been around them. And it became very clear to me very quickly that they were pulling information in from everywhere because they were trying to design the best they could that would fit Britain's needs. And my research, especially thanks to some of my counterparts who now work in the US, into the US equivalents, and I would say the Japanese equivalents, but that research has been a bit more iffy over the years, has been that they are doing the same thing. And there might be similarities in what comes out, because what they're looking for might have similarities, but that's more due to congruent development rather than convergent development. What am I saying here? I'm saying that development they have similar aims, similar goals, so it's going to the same place, but it's not convergent because it's not quite the same. It's like two sides of the same coin. They're different. They're on the same coin, but they're different. There's usually a reason for that. Shameless book plug. Ooh, about 9 minutes 20 in. So, what am I going to say for this? Well, thank you everyone who's been supporting me. Thank you everyone. We are moving. This is why I'm getting all this done today. Literally the next 2 weeks are going to be a mess. So I'm hoping to record at least 3 of these videos today. I've been trying to pack up here. I have to pack up more of this office. I've got all the books packed up. I've got all the most of the electronics packed up. Thank you. This move, this change in life, everything, all the stuff I'm doing now would not be possible without your support. Without you having gone out and bought this book, which is how I managed to justify my employment by various academic institutions. I always love the way the book, it doesn't matter that I get full teaching marks and I'm, get all that credit from the students. No, that doesn't affect employment. No. Oh, your book's selling well. Yeah. Oh, what do you like to discuss your contract for next year? Okay. All right. Hey, I'm not complaining. I get paid. But no, that's all thanks to you. That's all thanks to your kindness, your support, and your enjoyment of the book. So thank you. And there are going to be more soon. There are more coming out soon. I will get them all done. With the move, everything sorted out. And I'll also be hopefully able to do more of a regular schedule and a few other things which I've got planned. I've got all sorts of trips and things planned and all sorts of ideas. And a Historiathon to do, which I'm hopefully going to be fine to do in October, because I think that'll be cool. So let's start off with the earliest of the war experience carriers. Now, the thing is about Taiho, this war starts in 1939. Now, the Japanese don't get involved in war then, so you might be going, well, hang on, what war experience are they getting? Well, the Japanese are studying a lot about what's going on. They've also been interested in armoured carriers. And honestly, considering the amount of lying they already did with their carrier design, they should probably have done a bit more lying and actually done some armouring, because they have a similar problem as the British do. The British problem and the British reason for armouring their ships is, A, they're looking at operating on the other side of the world from the UK. So they all do their major maintenance, major construction, major repair, and construction is done in British yards. Remember, Britain is the centre of the British Empire, and whilst they're building up the infrastructure around the world, they ain't got it there yet. So from 1920s, 30s, well into 1940s, their plans are basically okay. So if we get any damage, we need to head back to the UK. So we want to make our ships as hard to damage as possible. So if they're coming back for major reasons, not for minor. Because the minor damage is easy to fix or is not going to cause any problems. And that affects their design and their ship design. The Japanese have the problem they don't have the infrastructure of the Britain. They don't have the infrastructure of America. They are planning on fighting these massive powers. Their whole naval aviation doctrine, I've talked about through, is based on hit-and-run attacks and attrition attacks, where they attrit the enemy with guerrilla-style warfare almost at sea, to wear down their strength. At that point, you really should make your own units as survivable as possible, because you're starting off from a scenario where your ships are outnumbered. So you need to make it so they can survive and carry on hitting, but they don't until the Taiho. And she has a top speed of 33 knots. Well, that's what the Americans think she has. According to the Japanese, it was 33.3 knots, but, what's a knot or so between friends? And the US Navy estimated that she was 35,000 tons in standard. She's actually roughly 30,000 tons. So they gave her a bit of a 5,000 ton over. Overall length, 855 foot. But the US Navy is estimating 860 foot. Again, not bad. For intelligence estimates based off pictures, etc., this is very, very good. Now, let's be honest, you would normally consider a 3% margin of error to be good. So, for a vessel which is 855 foot, you would be saying, as long as they get somewhere within 25.5 feet of that target, they're good. They get within 5 foot. That's really good. That's an error margin of less than 1%. We'll take that. Now, the other thing that happens is people, and this is one of the reasons why I was talking about the British earlier, people want to see the whole closed up bow and the fact the bow is built up to the flight deck. They start going, oh, this is the Japanese copying the Illustrious class. It's really not. There are reasons to do that. One of them is to do with weight, actually bearing the weight of the armor deck and building that structure into the hull and how you structurally spread the load. Metacentric height is fun, but also load height is a fun thing in ships, as the Japanese will tell you. This also gives you advantages when it comes to operations in seas which are rough. If you want to have more space, if you want to have more protection for aircraft forward, having the bow go up the full height to the flight deck is very useful. The reason the British have this is, as I've alluded to several points already in many videos, they have a thing about the North Sea keep nicking their aircraft. It's also one of the reasons why they are so late to adopt deck edge lifts and various other things. That literally, the greatest enemy for the Royal Naval Air Service at one point in World War I was not the Germans, it was the North Sea. We'll leave that being said and just carry on, but that is something interesting to look into. If you're ever bored and you are able to access the information, look at the number of aircraft lost over by the Royal Naval Air Service in World War I by a year. Look at how many of them are lost to the sea. The Japanese have their own experience with this. Now, they want a more survivable carrier for obvious reasons. It not only preserves their ability to operate their aircraft at sea in operations, but also it's more likely to preserve more of the crew if the carrier gets damaged. And those crew, those fitters, maintainers, personnel are important assets. Skilled, trained personnel are assets. They are something you have to care about. And the Japanese are watching 1939, 1940. They're watching what was going on, and this was informing their design process. They'd already been moving in this direction anyway, and honestly, if it hadn't been for the Yamato class project, I have no doubt, if they'd gone with a more conservative capital ship design scenario, I have no doubt you'd have seen armoured carriers, a class not too dissimilar probably to Taiho, appear much earlier, and probably more of them. Because it makes sense on a strategic level. And yes, war experience is building into this, but in many ways war experience is justifying something they were already going to. Now, the next class we're going to look at, the Audacious class. Now, these of course don't actually come into service till post World War II, because two reasons. One, the Royal Navy is basically surging out light fleet carriers like they're Smarties. And by that I mean the chocolate sweet. And two, the Royal Navy has this pause in carrier construction, and they have lots of bright ideas about carrier construction. And so the idea is you churn out the light fleet carriers to deal with them now, and the fleet carriers come in for the future. Remember when I talked about Purvis and how he was looking at both the needs for the wartime and the post-war Navy? The Audacious class, the Malta class, are far more about the post-war Navy. It's kind of like HMS Hood and the battle cruisers of the Admiral class. They are not being built for the Royal Navy of World War I. The Royal Navy doesn't need those ships in World War I. Look around what's happening in the world of World War I. By the point they're building them, do they need to go sailing around the world mopping up surface raiders? No. That's not needed. So what are they building those ships about? It's nothing to do with World War I. It's to do with what's coming after the war. Now you can say, well, what about what the Germans were building? Yeah, the British were probably more obsessed with what the Germans were building than the Germans. They knew exactly how much progress they were making. Yes, they were good for justifying construction. No, they weren't actually they didn't actually need construction to deal with them. With the Audacious class, again, it's sort of similar. It's the British building their next generation on from the Implacables, and in many ways the Audacious are evolved Implacables. They really are evolved Implacables. There are people who will shoot me down for saying that, but actually look at their hull structure, their framing, the way they've been internally organized. Yes, they are different. They are from a design study which is reconvened based on the 3 previous carrier design studies in the 1930s with wartime experience in about 1940, and it starts including 1940 through 1940 through 1941, and then into 1942 it reports and the designs are processed. But the fact is, this is Goodall in many ways being allowed to build the ships he was thinking about, he was dreaming about. And the Audacious class don't come into service during the war, but they reflect what the British were looking and thinking about. They reflect that the British were thinking, okay, we need a larger carrier, we need larger hangars, we still need survivability. We still need that to be part of them. She actually has deck armor, and well, especially HMS Eagle has deck armor of, and she's actually Audacious herself, is completed as HMS Eagle, to remember the carrier lost in 1942. She has a waterline belt of 4 inches. She has an armoured flight deck of between 1 and 4 inches, depending on where you are talking about. The sides of the hangar have a 1-inch armour. The hangar deck has 1 inch of armour. And as built, could take 60 aircraft. As aircraft increase in size, that drops to 45. But again, it's worthwhile thinking that that aircraft number is again her dealing with aircraft when she enters service, and she enters service in commission in 1951. By which point the aircraft are a lot bigger than the aircraft they were planning on putting aboard in 1942. This is one of the problems. Carriers are designed at a certain point, with a certain hangar capacity, usually based around the size of the aircraft they have at a time. And usually when you start asking, well, can we have a little bit more space and a little bit more size? We could take more aircraft now, but it would mean we could carry a decent size of aircraft later. Oh no, aircraft won't grow that much bigger. They always do. Aircraft always grow bigger. It's just a constant thing. And it's a constant argument you have. Honestly, this is an honest conversation I've had with people about current procurement projects, where I've been called in as a historical consultant. I love it. That's always a fun thing to do. But the amount of times that you hear what I call end of history, end of technology lines of, yeah, we've built this size, they won't get it bigger. Or they'll get smaller. And I go, how are they going to get smaller? They're going to be uncrewed. Have you looked at the size of uncrewed aircraft? Yeah. We've got the human out of them. Then there are a lot of small drones, but they're mostly the very small drones. The drones, the uncrewed combat aircraft that you are talking about, that we'll be operating from carriers, they're not small. They're pretty big. They're pretty big and pretty flexible. They're going to take up space. And that's the one thing, constant thing of these aircraft is on a carriers, they grow bigger. And so that means your flight deck, your hangar space, reduces in proportion. Because whilst it's the same size, now it can accommodate fewer aircraft because they individually take up more space. And they also take up more space to be manoeuvred around. So they require more space to manoeuvre. And they also require more space when they are positioned. So it has a cumulative impact. And that's what reduces your aircraft numbers. But the Audacious class really are designed by the Royal Navy around the idea of, we liked the Implacable class. We like the capabilities they bring. We like this size of carrier. We can include sufficient firepower for their defense. We can include sufficient armor for their protection. And we can include sufficient aircraft to do what we want with carriers. It's quite disturbing, really, how much the Royal Navy was so happy with that sort of size area of carrier. It just fits. It fits what they want to do, it fits how they want to act, it fits how they want to be. And then we have the Tico class of the Essexes. The long bow Essexes, or longbow. Now we fixed that one. I can't think why, but for some reason UK English PowerPoint settings automatically takes long bow and converts into long bow. Can't think why. Anyway. So the Ticos are a subclass of the Essexes. Basically, they work out that if they extend the bow, they will have better seakeeping. They will have better stability for operations. They'll also have more space for AA armament. And as we all know, the US Navy gets really, really interested in AA armament. They also do some things by reducing the length and some of the shaping of the flight deck to give better arcs of fire for the air defense. And what's really interesting about this class is how successful they are in their roles. They are very good aircraft carriers. And they do reflect wartime experience because their design shaping comes from watching what the British have been doing and going through in the Mediterranean. The Americans have had lots of observers over with the British watching what's been going on and going, oh, so, yeah, lots of AA guns. Yes. And those are very big bombs. Yes. Lots of AA guns. Yes. Lots of AA guns? Lots of AA guns. It's a constant thing. You really do need a constant supply of AA guns and a constant supply of ammunition for those AA guns. So you also need to think about the routes within your ship and where your CIC is going to be. You know, all those sort of scenarios of where your control center is going to be, I suppose we should probably call it at this point. You know, how they're going to get information there, how it's going to be organized. These things all start to matter. And realistically, this class represents not just the experience of building the first few Essexes, but also the experience of operating Yorktowns, of operating Wasp, of operating the Lexingtons, and seeing exactly how they were performing and how they were working in the scenarios they were in. The US was very frank. They had a lot of experience to gain from operating in the Pacific, but they also were learning from other places as well. They were taking into account what the British were going through, what the British carriers were operating on. One of the really interesting things is the American improvement in fighter control and fighter coordination. That's often put down to all sorts of experience, but the operating with USS Robin, as she was called, or HMS Victorious as the Royal Navy would call her, as basically a fighter carrier alongside Saratoga operating as a strike carrier. The Americans got to see a lot of the British technology and the British approach to air defense. And they looked at it and went, that's good. It doesn't necessarily all fit our needs. But we can take that as a starting point, and we can take our own experience as a starting point and infuse it together to a very good system. But also, the British system is also constantly evolving, because the British also look at some of the American experience and go, we like that idea. That doesn't fit with the way we generate our squadrons, though, or that doesn't fit with the way we generate our strikes, so we can't use that directly, but maybe if we do this, or maybe if we do that. And that's where you get a lot of interplay of information going backwards and forwards between those two. The Royal Navy and US Navy during World War II are really disturbing in some ways, in terms of the relationship they build up of information transfer. You can understand it to an extent, the Royal Navy, because it's used to working with it with the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, all the other Royal Navies, so basically it's just treating the US like it treats one of them. But the USN doesn't have that experience, doesn't have that history of anyone. So they're entirely inducted into this relationship, and in many ways the Americans are sometimes going, why are the British sharing all this with us? It's a bit weird. But the Americans are also fairly gregarious and sharing everything as well. So it works. Their politicians are weird on top of that. Their politicians are the ones who cause more trouble, but that's for the same for every nation. It's the politicians who cause trouble. The professionals usually get along pretty well. So really, these carriers are about them growing their capabilities in terms of air defense and in terms of seakeeping. The Midways, well, they're a slightly different scenario. Now, you've probably noticed I'm not taking a key ships approach to these videos, but that's because I'm talking about an overall, and I've already done some key ships videos on some of these classes. The Midway class are intriguing to me. They really are, because they historically come along later, but there is a very real possibility that if the 1942 Ocean Naval Act had been delayed in any way, shape or form, let's say to 1941 or 42, you could well have been dealing with a far more Midwayified Essex design, or even a full-on Midway, than the Essex. The reason I say this is because the Americans are studying exactly what's going on in the world around them as well, and they are facing the same decisions as the British. The Americans have avoided armoured carriers, in terms of armoured hangar decks, or even sort of armoured flight decks, because of top weight and because of the issues. They know they would like more survivable carriers. They would like them to have more survivability. But the thing is, on the cumulative limits again, because it's the cumulative limit which causes the issues, not the individual ship limit. If they go for that carrier, they can only get 5 of them. 5 27,000-ton carriers. Think about that. Now, honestly, think about it. As a scenario, if Britain and America had gone with, well, to get the full flight deck, full carrier we need, we're going to build 5 27,000-ton standard vessels. That's what we're going to maintain. Maybe Lexington, Saratoga as well for the Americans. For the Brits, there's no real options. You have to build from scratch. There is nothing there which can be turned into a 27,000-ton standard carrier. Courageous, Glorious, Furious, definitely not. That would break their keels. That really would. But so you're not doing. You could maybe take an Admiral class and do a similar conversion to it to a Lexington and get it in under the weight. You could maybe take a couple of the Admiral class hulls and do that. But again, it's just going to cause you more troubles elsewhere. But if you only had 5, if Britain and America each only had 5 carriers, think of how much trouble they'd be in World War II and in World War II. At the beginning of World War II. Britain has the most carriers of any nation in the world in 1939. Why? Because Britain needs carriers all over the world. And that's why they tend to be smaller, because of the cumulative limit from the treaties, and trying to fit them in within that limit and get the numbers you need. Same for America. But if you have something like the Second London Naval Treaty earlier, where you're allowed 27,000 tons as your upper limit for your standard design, and you're allowed to build as many as you want, then honestly, they're going to be like this. In fact, honestly, you would have probably seen a Yorktown with slightly bigger, but with armour on it, as the preferred American construction. That is probably what they would have been building, something like that, a lot earlier, if there hadn't been the cumulative limits. And the Midways or Essexes, whatever class follows on from that, would have been... Well, the Essexes I've described before are basically we need to simplify everything so we can build this as quickly as possible from the Yorktown. So this is what we want from the Yorktown design capabilities. How can we simplify this? Using some of the stuff from the Wasp, etc., decade lifts, etc., how can we simplify this and make this work for us? They would have probably done that. Still, because that fitted with building yards, brand new yards from scratch, training people from scratch. You want to make everything as much of a factory style process as possible. You don't want to have a lot of custom welds and custom forms and shapes, because those require very skilled, very experienced individuals. You don't have a lot of those, so you want to keep those things to a minimum. You want to have the rest of it, as much as possible, be as generic as it possibly can be, to make it as easy and straightforward to build as it can be. That's actually one of the reasons why the Midway class take longer, because everyone's building the Essexes, and in many ways the Midways are more of a continuation on from the Yorktowns than the Essexes. They are more the core ships of the fleet sort of thing. But they're still capable vessels. And it is using some war experience, because the one thing the Americans have found in their war experience is that, yeah, they made the right choice for their needs at the time with the treaty limits. But they also learned very quickly they wish they hadn't been forced to by the treaty. The treaty is one of those things which is a double-edged sword, and really, Britain and America cheat least because the treaty serves them best and gives them the most avenues for creation and for actually having the numbers to make up for their inadequacies. And usually it's the lower you go, the more you have cheating. We have the Italian cruisers. We have all sorts of fun things with the Japanese. We have even stuff with the French. And the British and the Americans do cheat. But honestly, everyone probably needed to be cheating a bit more to actually be happy with the treaties. Or they needed to make something more sensible. Because, except the Midway class, they do have war experience coming into them. The Americans are going, we wish our ships were a bit more survivable. And one of the really interesting things is, if the nuclear weapons don't come into service when they come into service, if nuclear weapons aren't ready when they are, carriers like the Midways, the British carriers, they are critical for the invasion of Japan, because the US was basically estimating, and this is one of the interesting, crucial things, was that pretty much every carrier which didn't have an armoured flight deck or armoured hangar was expected to be knocked out by kamikazes or submarines or enemy action within days of any invasion of Japan. Even the armoured carriers weren't expected to be able to operate for that much longer. And basically, the idea was that they were going to have to transfer their air groups entirely over to fighters. Anti-surface ship, anything for dealing with any surface ships or any surface action was going to have to be entirely left to capital ships. ASW was going to be entirely the responsibility of destroyers and running around on sloops, etc. And pretty much the carriers were going to be fighter carriers with their fighter aircraft providing combat air patrol and close support, but not carrying bombers. There's all sorts of plans drawn up for how you fit out the air groups, and the Royal Navy has plans for transitioning its air groups, because it has the battles and the operations off Okinawa, etc., where they're still taking bombers along. But they have plans to take it back and stockpiling up fighters, etc., so they can transfer over and change air groups into those carriers, basically all into fighter carriers. That's what they're going to end up being. They're going to end up entirely having air groups of Corsairs, Seafires, Hellcats. That's it. They are going to be loaded to the brim. Fireflies. That's what we're talking about. And that's because, while as survivable these ships are, the best way to make them survive is to keep the enemy as far away from them as possible. And for that you need a lot of fighters. And it's considered it's going to be an absolute trudge until they set up troops ashore and set up air bases ashore, which is really interesting, is that they're doing a lot of work on all sorts of ideas for how to build air bases ashore in Japan. And there was even discussion as to whether or not you would need to create harbours like they had in Normandy. I think they pretty much decided that the whole distances meant that that wasn't actually as practical. You know, taking it around the UK, taking it from the UK, the Mulberry harbours work, but doing it across the distance of the Pacific, not really sensible. But you need to build an airbase ashore. And the CBs and the mobile naval basing units of the British, so the CBs are the American ones, the construction battalions, and the British MONABs, are both working on ideas for how they're going to rapidly build air bases ashore. There are plans. There are lots of plans. it would have truly been an interesting scenario. And one of the interesting things to consider is that they had a very real problem because their plan was to use the amphibious forces that they had to first land the British and the British and the American forces and the British Empire forces. I'm using British here, but it's British Empire forces and the American forces in their positions, and then transfer the assault forces around to the Soviets to allow them to come to Japan. And that was the plan. There was an honest consideration as to whether there would be enough carriers, though, to be able to support that, and whether or not the Soviets might actually be left cooling their heels waiting for transport until they've established air bases ashore. But everything was dependent upon having these carriers because this is This is what a full capability carrier looks like in the late 1940s, late World War II, when they're thinking about it. This is what they're thinking. And that's also why the British have this design, the Malta class design. Now, this is the model produced by Dodders for me. Thank you very much for me to talk about it in previous videos. You'll notice they've got deck edge lifts, centerline lifts. That's because the British, as much as they like the idea of going to deck edge lifts, they still do not trust the North Sea. Getting the Royal Navy over their distrust of the North Sea is a long time coming. Basically, the Queen Elizabeth class are it. But there are still some, as anyone who has talked with their carrier groups and operations, there are still some very interesting instructions about when and how you can use lifts on the Queen Elizabeth class when you're going through the North Sea. I'm not saying that the Royal Navy is still paranoid about that particular patch of water, but they are paranoid about that particular patch of water. The Malta class are basically the British reaching for their new dream. I would say the Implacables, Audaciouses are pretty much the dream of the 1920s, 1930s. They're what the Royal Navy would like to build. Roughly 27,000 tons in standard. I know the Audacious class end up being far bigger than that when they're finally finished because of all the modifications done, etc. But we're talking roughly 27 to 30,000 tons in standard for them originally. For them and the Implacables original. We are talking something which is capable of carrying a significant air group and being very survivable. So it's perfect for all the long range operations. It's perfect for operating Mediterranean. It's perfect for the British geostrategic needs, basically. The Maltas we've had a bit of war experience, we'd like to grow beyond that. That 72 aircraft capacity, yeah, we need something bigger than that. We want something with a lot more lifts so we can move aircraft far more rapidly. We want something with the space to be its own unicorn, which to extent the Implacables Ark Royal had provided, and that's the Audacious has provided. That's what we want to carry on. We want something to be its own unicorn, HMS Unicorn, which of course they're forward aviation support ship, maintenance ship. We want something that can take all the aircraft, and we want it to be survivable, and we want it to be strong. And that survivability comes in many things, because actually, as you make a carrier bigger, you can also increase the level of subdivision. And by increasing the level of subdivision, you actually make it more survivable on a internal level. So as you can make the spaces more independent of each other and more able to, well, if we get damage in this spot, then we've still got this spot, this spot, this spot, these all intact around it, which means we won't sink because we'll retain buoyancy. You can actually play around the armor, and you can actually change the way you have the armor. You can have maybe more armor concentrated in magazines. You can have maybe the armor differently deployed over the decking area, etc. Those are real things you can do to make your situation better and improve your design. Now, admittedly, this shows a long-running thing of the British with having a twin island design. People like to, again, with the Queen Elizabeth class, claim it's something new. No. The British have been looking at a twin island carrier for a long, long time. Actually, it started off with one of the predecessors of Hermes in a design tree, which had an island on both sides of the ship. And they're supposed to land and take off through the islands. We'll leave that to one side. That was a very, very potentially traumatizing experience for many pilots, but we'll leave that to one side. The Malta class really do represent a lot of learning going on behalf of the British, whereas to an extent the American one you see it less because the Americans Their compromise was the armouring, so you still see the same size of carrier. The British compromise had been, we need to make it survivable, so they shrunk the size of carrier in order to add on the armour and make it survivable. Once you have the scenario, the British are going, woohoo! Now, the really interesting thing is, usually at this point, people go, well, this is because the British have been taking lessons from the Pacific War and are considering major fleet battles with carriers. They'd always been considering that. They'd always been considering multi-carrier operations. And one of the reasons why you have a twin island structure on the Maltas is because of multi-carrier operations and working together multiple carriers and having enough space in the island structure for enough communications antenna and enough systems as the British put in the islands. And for the way they were going to structure it around with the hull configuration. Now, the interesting scenario you have here is how similar the Malta and the Midways are. They are very similar. And actually, this is the point at which you can call it congruent rather than convergent development. This is how you illustrate it, and this is why I have the Malta. Despite the fact they're not built here, they're the only class which aren't built in this, I have them here. It's because them and the Midways are so similar in so many ways. They're both ordered in 1943. And they both represent the point at which the British have been synthesizing their research and also seen what the Americans have done in their major carrier battles, which has proved a lot of the British ideas about major carrier battles in the British mind. It's also proved to the Americans a lot of their ideas about carrier battles. It's kind of interesting in that the Americans go away from it going, yeah, the big punch, that really does work. Yes, we have to keep a constant operation of fighters for defense, but yeah, the big punch really does work. And the British come away from those carrier battles going, yeah, the constant operation really does work. That's the constant operation. So you can have a constant flow of strikes and constant keeping it up. Yeah, that really works. You sit there and look and go, it's the same data and you're both drawing completely different conclusions. It's where they're coming from. The British are looking at it in their terms of their context of their empire. So they're looking at something which basically proves their theories about how they operate. They want to be able to do the big punch. Trento, Merzel Kabir, they like to do the big punch as well. They usually use it because the opportunities that come up during World War II for them are harbour strikes. But they like to do the big punch as well. For the Americans, they get more of an opportunity to do it at sea, because, let's be honest, by the time they get close enough that they are regularly visiting areas where the Japanese fleet are inhabiting, the Japanese fleet aren't a problem for them to really go after hunting. They will go hunting, ghouls, strike if they have a chance, but honestly, the Strategic Air Force and their work at sea has done a large job, most of the job for them. That's the problem in life. Sometimes you can be too successful. You take out so many of your enemies at sea, you no longer have them to attack in harbour, so you can't draw off your harbour attacking skills. Although, considering the Mark 14 torpedo, that might have been a good thing for the US Navy. Ultimately, what these carriers all demonstrate to me, and always have demonstrated to me, especially the more research I've done on them over the years, and while I was doing my PhD, they represent to me the fact that everyone knew what they really wanted and really needed from the carriers, and they all had this idea of what a carrier should look like by the point in the mid-1930s. It's just they started from this perfect design and then compromised down to what they could get on a tonnage they were able to use, or what they thought they could get away with. And that's a problem. That's a problem to me. That is a real problem. And it's really post-World War II when you start to see new designs emerge, when you start to see new evolutions. Especially this comes from the US Navy, so I have to say a lot of the videos coming from Future and the rest of the year are going to be very US Navy centric, because they're the ones who build the most carriers. We talk about a few other nations as well, but US Navy is going to take a lead. The reason is because the others aren't building carriers the same way. Which is ultimately the thing I find most disappointing about the Malta class. because if the 4 of these had been built, you would have seen the ultimate expression of the British carrier doctrine and carrier development in the 1930s and 20s as honed by war experience and as put out as these ships. It would have been something which I could point to and go, look, these navies were all thinking about this. And this is what they produce once they are able to show actual concrete data from war experience, not just exercises. And exercises produce a lot of false positives. They produce a lot of good information, but they produce a lot of false positives as well. Because of the way they're structured, because of the requirements of exercises. But the thing is, that doesn't happen. Which leads us to today's question. And today's question is this. I don't think you get the Malta class without war experience, but I do think you get the Midways, I do think you get something like the Audacious, and I do think you get the Taihos. So I want you to think about World War II, and I want you to think that the cumulative limit is dropped off in the 1930 London Naval Treaty, not the 1937 London Naval Treaty. So the first London Naval Treaty, not the second. I want you to think about that. And so the US Navy starts war with, let's be honest, fully armoured Yorktowns. That sounds cool. Kind of like Vanguard's fully armoured battlecruiser, the fully armoured Yorktown. I'm now imagining USS Enterprise with armour. No fault, well, a single carrier would probably a carrier would single carrier an entire enemy navy, but it's a possibility. And that the Japanese carriers would be built closer to the Taiho. I also think under such a treaty limit scenario, you might actually find the Japanese don't leave the treaty system, but we'll leave that to one side. They get rid of the cumulative limits in 1930. And so they're all building 27,000-ton carriers. Standard displacement. What do you think happens? How do you think that changes things? What carriers do you think are built? Do you agree with me that the Royal Navy, the US Navy's carriers, turn into one with probably, I'm going to guess, one with roughly 90 aircraft and slightly less armour, and one with about 80 aircraft and more armour. So we're talking 72 to 80 for the Royal Navy, 90 to 100 for the Americans, slightly more armour for the Royal Navy, slightly less armour for the Americans. And the Japanese are probably going to lie and claim they managed to make something which has the same aircraft capacity as the Americans, but has the same armouring as the British. And that will cause some British naval constructor to go, so either they're made of paper mache or they're lying. Anyone want to guess which? Because this is the Japanese Navy we're talking about. It could be paper mache. The Royal Navy had some very interesting views on some of the Japanese claims in this period. Alright, what have we got coming up next week? Conception, operation, conclusion of HMS Melbourne and Bonaventure. I'm going to be recording this, and Sunday's video are the last videos to be recorded in this office. And then hopefully next Sunday's video, so that'll be Sunday the 18th, will be recorded in my new office. Hopefully, he says. Thank you very much everyone for watching. I'm sorry these videos aren't as long, aren't as full, and aren't quite the way I planned them to be. They're far more theoretical discussion, going through all the concepts. But yeah, I can do that in the time allowed. And as said, I do all the technicals in the key ship videos anyway, so I don't feel so bad about not including those. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed.